Hi, Stella.
Hi there. We're here to talk about our book, When Kids Say They're Trans, A Guide for Thoughtful Parents. That'll be out in September. We can't wait.
Yes. And if you pre-order the book, you'll also be able to join us for a live free webinar. It's called Do's, Don'ts, and Damage Control.
Yeah, and we thought we'd do a webinar, a very practical webinar based upon our book about what parents can do, what parents perhaps shouldn't do, the don'ts, and also damage control, because so many parents ended up in this before they knew anything about gender, and there's a lot of damage control that kind of needs to be done. So we address that issue with a webinar on Sunday, 27th of August at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're going to leave a lot of room for Q&A so that parents can get their questions in.
Right. So if you want to steer your child into a more thoughtful place, maybe away from social and medical transition, these do's and don'ts and damage control will really help you out. So go to whenkidsaytheirtrans.com and click on the banner that says special pre-order offer to register for this live Zoom event. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we probe the gender landscape within contemporary culture.
And we consider the implications of prioritizing personal identity over other aspects of the self.
This is the thinking person's take on gender.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. Good afternoon, my lovely Stella. How are you?
Good. It feels ages since we've just had the two of us.
I know.
I've missed you, Sasha.
I know. I've missed you too. We've been so busy with guests, but it's really nice to kind of have our one-on-one time.
Yeah, I do miss it, and when we have it, I always feel great afterwards. I suppose I've become accustomed to your face, my darling.
And me accustomed to your face and voice. I remember before we started doing this podcast, every time I heard you in an interview or like on your film, I just was like so enamored by your voice, but I get to talk to you all the time now, and it's amazing.
That's lovely. Yeah,
that's really lovely. What's new in Stella land?
Well, you know, I've been in a kind of zone of recovering from the conference for a while, because it's been lovely. It's been lovely being able to kind of just hang out and go for lunch with people, and maybe for a little while not talk about gender and
yeah,
you know what I mean. So that's been nice. I've been doing a few bits and pieces on my Substack. Had a great Q&A there recently, and I'm going to have a conversation with Alistair Gunn about what parents need to know to help themselves. Because I think we've talked so much, and you will know this, we've talked so much about the ROGD kid. And of course our book is coming out soon. But we haven't talked so much about parents of ROGD. Like, I know that we've talked a lot about the trauma they've gone through, but what about the traits, and what about how they can impact the situation? You know what I mean? So we're going to chat about that, me and Alistair. So that should be interesting. How about yourself?
Great. I'm doing well. I'm settled in my house, came back from the conference. It was amazing. I mean, honestly, it was such a powerful professional experience, because unlike most professional conferences that can be a little dry, there was so much energy. There was so much collaboration and excitement. It was so powerful. And I got a bit of a sinus infection, so I came home and had to recover from that. But I'm feeling much better now, kind of getting back in the swing of things. And for me, something that I'm thrilled about that I've been working on for my membership group is a kind of onboarding system, because some feedback I've gotten from parents is that Subscribestar, where I have all of my parenting resources, it's kind of like a Facebook feed, right? So it's just a chronological posting of new content, new videos, whatever, but it's a bit hard to navigate. So I've created something called an archives document. It's a 1-page with links to every post and titles, so that parents can go to one sheet and research the topic they want. Like if they're a parent of a boy, they can type in the word son or boy or boys or males and find every post I've ever done about boys or social transition or self-help or whatever. So It's been huge, and I've created this giant onboarding video to help families navigate the Subscribe Star website, how to update their preferences, how to change their username, how to get on our Discord channel. So it's been a long process in the works, but that's going to be, it might be out by the time this episode airs, but that's a huge project that we've been working on, and I'm thrilled. So it'll make it a lot easier to kind of move around in that platform and find what people are looking for.
Because so many parents are specific about what they want, so it's going to be really helpful. Yeah,
that's great. It's going to be great. We're so excited. Registration is officially open for our weekend of workshops in Annapolis, Maryland, September 21st through 24th.
You can visit whenkidsaytheirtrans.com and click on Weekend of Workshops to find more information. We've had some really, really special events so far, and we're really looking forward to this one in September.
Yes, and if you've attended previous events, please know this is going to be all new material, workshop style, based on our new book, When Kids Say They're Trans. So we hope to see you there, and check our website for more information. So today we are continuing to talk about schools. I mean, this is a huge topic that a lot of people are interested in, and we became aware that teachers and counselors themselves feel lost. Like, we know parents often feel lost with this stuff, but what about school personnel? What about school staff? And so, as part of our education series, we want to just talk a little bit about, if you are a teacher, if you're a counselor, and you're encountering some of these things, what do you do? How do you go about it? How do you maintain your relationship with students while also being mindful about closing doors for their identity exploration? So that's the idea.
When I give quite a few talks in schools, and so often after the talk, at the start of the talk, they're generally very quiet. I've really noticed an arc. And then I leave a lot of room for questions towards the end, and they come fast and thick at the end. They don't come near me at the beginning with questions, because they feel way out of their depth and very intimidated. And so many people give me a very heartfelt thanks, which isn't usual after a talk. Well, you get nice thanks, that was very interesting stuff, but you get a very, very heartfelt from teachers, from school counselors, from principals, saying, like, I was really all over the place about this issue. And I think, people are sometimes quite harsh in schools. I think, in fairness, it came in like a rocket, and they haven't been given training. They want to just teach, or they want to be a school counselor. They don't, this has been landed upon them, and it feels like they're really quite in the centre of the political situation. You know what I mean? Just as much as sports people, I often feel they just want to talk about rugby or cycling. It's their thing. And they no more want to get into this kind of sociological commentary or psychological understanding. And it's been imposed upon them. And I feel an awful lot of them feel, I just want to do the right thing. I want some guidance about what is the right thing. And nobody seems to agree with what is the right thing. And frankly, the guidance I've got is quite scanty. It's not very, it doesn't feel very attuned to where I'm at in my school. That's the most common feeling I get from teachers. And I don't envy them. You worked in a school, didn't you, for a long time? So you'd know the vibe of working in a school.
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on the school and the school district, and I'm happy to talk about my experience. But I think before we jump into those details, let's say there's a teacher or a school counselor. I mean, school counselors are more likely to have been exposed to concepts around gender and gender identity than a teacher. But let's say generally a school staff or school personnel is episode number 1 of Gender A Wider Lens. They've landed here. They know nothing about
You're very
all
welcome.
This stuff.
Yeah.
How do we just kind of ground them in some basics so that we can build on our discussion?
Yeah.
So what would we say?
For me, I would like any teacher or counsellor who's never really listened to much about gender to know that there's a few conflicting theories. There's a theory that, gender identity is within you. It's like your soul. It lives within you. It's not something physical, but it's actually something that might make somebody feel compelled to present in a different manner. For example, a born biological girl might feel compelled to present as a boy. People who believe in that theory feel that it's the job of all the involved adults to facilitate this transition as fast as possible, almost as if the person is gay, but needs it acted out by everybody in the room. And so that is one strong theory. There's another theory that it would be that, queer theory, which is more along the lines of you can present in any way you want, and our job is just to allow for a free society that people who want to present can present. And then there's a third theory, which is more where I land. I hope I'm not going too fast, but a kind of developmental model of understanding where some people develop a condition that's described as gender dysphoria. It presents as gender-related distress. And these people really fixate on the fact that they want to be somebody else, and that person has a different embodiment. And they want to, for example, a girl might want to present as a boy, be seen as a boy, and all their distress gets channeled into that. And there's a lot of ways we can kind of fixate our distress on one thing, for example, an eating disorder or other issues. And it is an actual condition, which is often used to people when I do present at schools and to school counsellors. Mm-hmm. It is a mental health condition in the DSM. It is acknowledged as a mental health condition. And I think people can sometimes miss that. It's called gender dysphoria, and anybody can look it up and look at the criteria and see what's involved. So there's conflicting theories about what it is. And as a result, the schools are left not knowing about these theories, but just thinking, why is the advice so polarized? Why is it so different?
Yeah.
Why are so-called experts saying completely different things? And I'm just the teacher just trying to follow it. That is why. Because the theories conflict with each other.
Yeah. And I think to add on to what you're saying, teachers, especially if they have been teaching for many decades, they've probably noticed some shifts in the culture, shifts in the way young people are thinking about things like identity, sexuality, gender. And while some of these shifts, cultural shifts, seem to be really positive, teachers may also notice that a lot of kids that they know are kind of changing their identity and changing their gender. And I think something that we have become aware is that teachers may not understand, or school staff may not understand, that the way kids' gender identity exploration is responded to by adults can have a pretty profound impact on what happens when they leave school. So there's almost like a social affirmation to medical transition pipeline that teachers may not be aware of. Because I think, especially in America, and I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but to kind of tie it back into my experience in a school, I worked in a charter school where the sense of community was a really important kind of ethos. Like teachers, school counselors, administrative staff, we all were meant to build incredibly tight and close relationships with our students. And it was very powerful. It felt like a big family. And in a way that was like really beautiful and positive thing. So in the spirit of being close with students and kind of acting as like a big family, there can be a sense that like we just want to validate the students. We want to make sure they feel supported and loved and heard, which is great. But you may not recognize that validation, especially when a young person is experimenting with gender or exploring a new identity, can kind of solidify that identity and almost acts as a way to kind of close doors to the evolution of that identity or the exploration of something else. So when you are a teacher and you are in a school environment that is really encouraging and supportive and connected with the students, the easiest thing may just be, let me validate, let me make sure the kid feels good about themselves. Let me just make sure that the student feels heard and believed. But it's a bit tricky, right? Because if that means that they're necessarily going to be more likely to medicalize or have a surgery or start a hormonal intervention that may not necessarily be the best thing for them, it's really hard to know, like, what is the role of the teacher or the counselor?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something very important. Schools have changed from being a place to educate and impart knowledge to being a community that kind of supports identities and supports the evolution and of
the mental
person,
health,
and the development of the person. that is interesting because I've been studying this quite a bit, and I kind of got into kind of studying how schools began. And schools actually began, funny enough, in the US, and it was to teach children to become good biblical scholars. They were taught originally, you know what I mean? They were brought together to learn scripture and to become good purists. And then it went into Europe, in France and in Germany, and it was very much to create good citizens, to create good Christians. At the time, this is what they were doing. And then it went out into actually, creating the whole person and imparting knowledge. But now, in a way, we've come back almost full circle, where schools are creating good citizens. They're reflecting the values of society. And the teachers are expected to teach the children according to the accepted values of societies. Now that's kind of interesting, because there's plenty of teachers I know who would have quite radical views of society, who are kind of falling in with the school ethos, but it's not necessarily, they might teach geography, but they have their own views of life.
Yeah.
And yet there's a presumption that we all agree with how a good citizen will live, and we're now going to teach them that. So it's an interesting kind of imposition on teachers and counsellors. Teach them how to be what is accepted as a good citizen. It's a kind of nice idea, but it's also, I think, more and more, there's mental health has really impacted schools. And I wonder, is there going to come a time where we're going to say, we need a mental health facility beside the school so that schools can do their teaching and the mental health is on campus, but it's maybe even in the same building, but it's a bit more divided because I find so many teachers are talking to me and principals who are saying, I'm doing an awful lot of mental health and I'm a maths teacher and I don't think I'm doing it right, and I don't know what to do, because the fair play, the students presume that the adult will know what to do. And so I know this isn't quite relevant, but it is relevant to how schools have got to the place where they've got, where they're they're randomly, massively a huge part of somebody's transition is their school life. How did that come to be? It's because so much has been asked of the school teachers. And is that appropriate? I'm not sure it is, because that's not what they trained for.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember when I worked in a school, there was this immense pressure for every single teacher to kind of play these dual roles, multiple roles, as like an emotional support, a mental health support, and a math teacher, and after school volleyball coach, or all of these things that teachers are expected to do. And it's very tiresome. It feels unfair because teachers are already stretched so thin. So I think, in this podcast, we want to almost kind of take some pressure off of the teachers and also help teachers become aware of how a little thing can actually have a really positive impact. It doesn't have to be like this giant overhaul of what's happening at the school. So in your experience, when you have worked with school staff, what are some kind of important little things that you encourage them to do to support the students without necessarily closing the doors to their identity exploration, which is a normal part of adolescence?
Well, one thing is, the point you lifted earlier is always something that I kind of rest on quite a lot, which is identity exploration is a natural developmental aspect of adolescence. And that if it gets foreclosed, or if it prematurely lands and fixates and concretizes, it doesn't bode well for the future. It can be very good at that beginning. When they foreclose, they can feel very satisfied. It's very nice to land and become certain and say, this is my identity. The exploration is over. I'm sorted. And it's like the person who's chosen their college course. They know where they're going. There's something very kind of brain satisfying about saying, I'm certain, I know where I'm going, I know what I'm doing, you know what I mean? But it's actually, that uncertainty is part and parcel of the adolescence experience, and it's more appropriate for the adults to pull back from encouraging any sort of solidification of any identity. That whether they're going to go to this college or that college, or study this or study that, or go and be a sports star or a dancer or gender or like even their sexual orientation, that an exploratory kind of approach is appropriate right up until their early 20s. This is what they kind of should be doing psychically. And this, it's like this, the teachers know it because they've been working with students for so long. But when they hear somebody like myself as a psychotherapist actually saying, this is exactly what they should be doing, it's like, well, I knew it intuitively, but now you've said it, I feel much more confident about, it's not my job to hurry along a closure and a tying up and put the bow on, we've got my identity sorted. That is not the adult's job. The adult's job is to continue with the exploratory process with kind of nice kind of noises along the same. That's really interesting. You know, it's great that you're exploring your identity, and it's great. And I hope you're managing to have some joy in this process, because it's going to be the most exciting years of your life. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to, right, you've got your identity, bang. Now, where's the next label?
Yeah. We can talk maybe even about some kind of specific scenarios, because I'm just thinking about my time in the school. There's the very individual, like one-on-one, where a kid might ask the teacher something specific about changing their name or using their pronouns. Then there's the more broad question about, you know, are parents being notified about various identity explorations the kid is having? Then there's stuff about school policy. So like, I really like the framework you used. So let's say it's more of an individual situation, and there's a young person who, let's say, quote, came out to a teacher with their identity. I love what you said about, well, that's very interesting. You know, this is a time of a lot of exploration. So, you know, I always say that the best response usually lies somewhere in the middle. So neither are you saying, well, that's ridiculous, you're a girl, you can't become a boy. I don't believe in that. That's one extreme. The other extreme is, oh my gosh, you're so brave. I'm so proud of you that you found your authentic self, and you're kind of really amplifying this identity exploration. And the middle road might look something like, thank you for trusting me to share that. That's very interesting. I mean, I think identity exploration is a long road, and it's fascinating that you're here right now. Is this something that you've been able to talk with your family about? Because that seems like an important thing to share with them. So that's another piece that often gets very challenging for teachers. Like when a student is confiding in you, in a way, you really want to honor that, because maybe they selected you as the adult they trust, and you don't want to trample on that. On the other hand, it's very risky when your relationship with a student might inadvertently build a wedge between that student and their parent, right? So trying to find a way to, you know, appreciate the confidence they showed in you, while also keeping in mind the appropriate structure, which is the family has to make decisions around these things together. So I think that's one way you can kind of hold that middle ground.
I know in Ireland, in the education system, one of the first lines of the Department of Education guidelines is the parent is the primary educator of the child, which is nice. It's kind of giving some respect to them. But I think it's very important that what you just lifted there, I think is very important to think about. And when I discuss this in schools, that you can see faces going, oh God, because I talk about triangulation, and I talk about, we know we should stay away from triangulation. Triangulation is when one person is the victim, often the student, one person is the persecutor, sometimes it's the parent, and one person is the savior. And it could be the school counselor or the English teacher that you've confided in. And that being kind of deemed the savior in somebody's life, it can be very heady. You can feel filled with power. You can feel, I'm going to save this kid. They're very distressed. I'm the one kid, one adult, one important adult in their life, and I'm going to be this person. And I'm going to be the adult that I should have had when I was a kid. And we can really get into that persona, and it can be very, very damaging for the family. Now, we all know, schools know it, counsellors know it, we all know that getting in the way between parents and children is something we do at our peril. Now, if the children are in danger, social services should be called. If it's a difference of beliefs or a difference of values, I would argue that parents should be honoured and the child should be honoured that they can handle the fact that their parents have different values. It doesn't mean they're in danger. It doesn't mean that, you know, that something frightening is happening. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of us have different values to our parents in some levels. And that's part of navigating family life. You have a sibling who really irritates you because their politics are frankly objectionable, but they're your sibling, and that's the richness of family life, that you handle that. And so this idea that this has suddenly become a frightening force that people have to be saved from, it's very authoritarian, it's very intrusive, and you know, it's dismissing the richness and depth that the loving family can give, even when you disagree.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think this is so important because, and I want to share a little bit about my time as a school counselor, because I've definitely noticed a concept creep that can exist, especially amongst social workers and school counselors and people in the mental health field especially, that conflates not necessarily having the right opinion about gender and sexuality issues with literally being a dangerous or toxic or abusive parent. And I want to kind of confess that I think I was wrapped up in that thinking for some time, even as a school counselor. So one thing I'll share is when I started our school's GSA, Gay Straight Alliance, this was a population of students who were kind of coming from lots of low-income, working-class families, immigrant backgrounds, tended to be a pretty religious population. And I was aware for sure that there were some students I knew who were gay, questioning their sexuality, and that this would be completely not accepted at home. So in order to try and protect the privacy of these students, we named our club with a kind of generic name, like a student advocates club or something like that. And when kids were signing the waiver to get permission to join, it was a pretty general poster, like this is a place for students to explore self-expression and support one another. And we didn't put gender, we didn't put sexual orientation on the flyer.
Oh, did you know?
In hindsight, I now see that was coming from a really positive place, you know? And I think when you are thinking about specific students who you know are experimenting with their sexuality or their identity, and you have on the back of your mind this possibility that the family will become very intrusive and maybe pull them out of the group or whatever, you know, it's so easy in my mind to see how with sexual orientation, that kind of protective instinct can occur in the teacher or the counselor. I mean, that's for sure where I was coming from. I had no kids that were explicitly questioning their gender when I thought up this idea of like protecting their privacy. This was about sexual orientation. So I just want to point out, like, if you find yourself in this situation with the school, keep in mind that they probably haven't thought very deeply about what the implications are for something like gender identity, where the kid is asking to be called new pronouns and changing their identity at school. This is a totally different thing. So, you know, if I could go back in time, I would have done things very differently, you know, with the way we structured our club. But I am aware that is the kind of impulse behind some of this behavior on the school's part that seems to be like a little bit secretive or something like that.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's so understandable. And I so get how it emerged. And then I start thinking of Malcolm Clark from the LGBT Alliance. He does some really, really good writing. He's got a Substack and he's really interesting. He's a gay man. And I remember, like, we were working on, we've got a few GenSpec school policy samples, and it's quite interesting. So we have one for America, one for Canada, one for Ireland, and they all have different cultural kind of emphasis, if you follow me, because they're slightly different countries, different kind of cultural. And I remember when I was talking to Malcolm about these school policies, and he was saying, but why have a gay club? You should have a club with a purpose. This is encouraging introspection. in teenagers who could probably benefit more from, of course, tolerance and acceptance and a supportive and a kind of an acknowledgement. But if you're going to ask people to be in a gay club, are you asking them, where are you going with that? Like you in fairness, he argues it much better than I do. But he basically says teenagers are flailing around, and we're all flailing around, humans are, but with a purpose. Like if it was a purpose like climate or politics or supportiveness or promoting acceptance, this would give them a lot more focus than just our identity. If you
totally
follow me. He completely argued me out of it, and I was like, this is a really good point, actually asking, kind of, imagine if we had a club for I suppose specifically Irish people or people who are this, it's like, well, what are we going to do? Talk about ourselves? Wouldn't we be better focusing on something that is some sort of common goal? So imagine if it was an Irish club. It could be music, or it could be, you know what I mean? Something that's beyond the self-identity. Yeah. So anyway, that gave me a whole new concept around it. And I think it's a good point. And I think culturally I was told, that won't wash in America. And I thought, really? Could we readdress that? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've touched on this a little bit before, but I think when we think about the way, for example, let's say we take the consolidation of a sexual orientation over the lifespan, right? A lot of people will look back and say, I was really afraid of my sexual orientation. I had a lot of shame about it. So I think the reason we have these, specific clubs based on identity and self-introspection and self-reflection is because it's an attempt to counteract maybe the unhelpful messages in society, right? But I do think for the most part, many young people have at least heard somebody somewhere say it's okay to be gay, just be proud to be yourself. And that message is going to filter in. And so, like, I remember being young, a lot of people figured out their sexual orientation and were able to come out without necessarily a club celebrating them. They figure it out, and as long as you have friends who care about you and love you for who you are, you will eventually get over that barrier of kind of difficulty with it. Now, granted, to be fair, in the D-Trans panel that you did in the GenSpect D-Trans Awareness Week conference, a lot of individuals there, a lot of lesbians said the shame is real and it's really hard to get over. So I think it puts, just being aware of all these issues is just important because there are a lot of moving parts. And if you are a teacher or a school counselor, it's just so crucial to understand that it's not as simple as just having a blanket policy about names and pronouns and that's going to solve everyone's problems. Not necessarily, because there may be internalized homophobia going on. There may be a lot of complicated family issues or mental health issues. So, I don't know if there's a simple answer about things like clubs and how to structure them. But I do think, being able to hold the identity exploration with a light touch and not make too huge a deal of it in either direction is important. And this kind of brings us to another point, which is, I think teachers need to be empowered to get back to what they know how to do best, which is teaching their subject.
Yes.
So if you're approached with a young person questioning their identity, just as we mentioned earlier, you can acknowledge it, thank them for saying something, and then just redirect back to the real reason that you're there, which is to teach history or geography or literature or whatever your job is. So that way you can stay focused on what your competence is in and not burden yourself with trying to be somebody's psychoanalyst or their kind of gay pride leader. There's a lot of other better ways for you to spend your energy.
Yeah, and if you're a geography teacher and if somebody came out as gay or lesbian or bisexual, I think most teachers would hold neutral space saying, okay, we'll get on with our lesson plan, because discussing it, where are we going with that? It's not relevant to the class. Now, if it's a counsellor, they're in a different position. I do find I've given quite a few seminars to just school counsellors, for example, and I find they're in a very lonely position, because the school generally says, there you go, you're the school counsellor, deal with it. And everybody in the school knows full well that they are imposing a burden on this school counsellor who's just going, oh, do you know what I mean? Because they can handle all sorts of other things, but this has come in like a rocket. They really feel very out of their depth. And the school are very quick to just look, with interest to, well, the school counsellor is going to deal with this. I'm not.
That's right.
Right. So I think they're in a very lonely position. And I encourage people who are school counsellors to do a bit of reading. You might be reluctant. You might find it very, very heavy and dense and an awful lot of information. I do think a bit of reading around it is essential, because it's not going away. It's going to stay in your school. You've got to kind of on some level read up about it, so you understand the acronyms, you understand the terms, and you kind of understand the concepts underlying it. There is plenty of guidance out there. Of course, GenSpect is a school guidance, but there's loads of different guidances out there. So you can look at the different ones and see what suits you. Now, there are some schools that have regulations and policies. A huge amount of schools don't have regulations and policies. They have a culture of affirmation, or a culture of presumption that we will go with pronouns and names. What's happened with a lot of schools, though, and so many have told me, is we went in very happily into the affirmative culture, and we changed, the students' names as and when they wished, and the pronouns. But what has happened is a kind of a tail is wagging the dog now, because some of the students are changing names very regularly, and some of them are changing pronouns very regularly. And it's created an emphasis in the class which is irrelevant to the classroom, because we have gone with this idea of whatever they want, they get. So then suddenly it's a new name, it's a new pronoun.
Yeah.
And the other students, and I can understand why, but the other students are kind of alive to the fact that there might be a misgendering because there's a new pronoun and the teacher doesn't know it. So it feels like a continuous kind of gag going on in the schools.
Wow.
Where, and the teachers are feeling like, I'm on eggshells. I misgendered this kid, but in fairness, they've changed the pronouns a few times and I got mixed up. And it feels like the students are running the show here. And that's what so often the schools are saying. It started really, like yourself were saying, it started in a really good place. It's ended up in this kind of quite combative, you got it wrong. And they're thinking, this is not how a school, we're meant to be showing guidance and adult, authoritative kind of a road before them. And instead it feels like very, as I often say, it's very child-led, not child-centered. And so if the child is leading the way in how gender is treated in the school, arguably the child doesn't have an adult sensibility. It certainly doesn't have the future of the school in their mind. It might not have the greater good in their mind. It might be very much about one specific friend that they have. And it's all about them. Yeah. Because they're a kid and they have a child sensibility. So the adult's job, whether they're a school counsellor or a principal or a teacher, is to think of the greater good, to think of the school, to think of the kind of the equilibrium, and to realise the strongest role we can give as adults is guidance and a good kind of supportive space where the adults are in charge. And I don't mean it in an authoritarian way, but they're giving guidance and they're not shying away from their responsibility as adults and letting the children lead, because it's a burden on the children's shoulders if the children are leading. We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for the show.
To take an even deeper dive and support the show, join our listener community for access to exclusive content, practical tools, and resources supporting gender and identity exploration. We're so grateful to our sponsor, GenSpect, an international organization which offers an alternative to WPATH, providing a range of education, resources, and supports to anyone impacted by gender distress. GenSpect unites many different organizations globally and gives voice to thousands of previously untold stories. For more info, visit genspect.org. And thank you to our sponsor, GetUp. Get is an association of therapists who believe that individuals experiencing gender-related concerns ought to be treated using a whole person approach.
We connect like-minded clinicians, provide educational resources and training, and help people with gender dysphoria find the right help.
Visit GETA at genderexploratory.com. And now back to the conversation. Yeah, and I mean, I hear you saying that, and of course I agree with you. We have a whole podcast about this. But this is really counter to the conventional wisdom that is often being provided in gender-related school trainings, which is let the child lead. So if you are a teacher or a counselor, and let's say your school has actually, provided trainings and offered reading materials and resources, and it comes from the affirmation approach, which is whatever the student's identity questioning is, you encourage the identity questioning, you follow their lead in any way you can. And also you socially transition the student. So I think maybe now is a good time to outline what social transition is. And maybe we can give some guidance to teachers who are like, well, we got that training and we tried it, like you said, and it's a runaway train. And now all the kids who weren't questioning before are questioning now. And we have like 30% of our kids are questioning their gender and we're not sure what to do. So let's maybe touch on that. Social transition is a kind of psychosocial intervention. It's relatively new in the world of gender nonconforming children and how therapists and teachers think about them. And social transition is a process by which you change the way you interact with a child as though they really are a different sex. So if it's a female child, you might call her by a male name. You might use he, him pronouns for her. You might allow her to use the boys' restroom. You treat her ostensibly as though she's literally a boy. And social transition is an intervention which has pretty profound impact on the psychological experience of a young person. And often it's being kind of requested pretty strongly and forcefully with a lot of urgency. And sometimes it seems to reduce the distress of the child, but oftentimes does not, and actually seems to exacerbate the self-consciousness of the child because now they really have to play up that role that they're literally a boy. And schools have been using this intervention as though it's very well studied, very well established, and in these school trainings around gender-related issues, it's prescribed as though it is just the gold standard of what we do when a kid is questioning their identity. And this is a really challenging and problematic thing in my view, because it can create more problems than it resolves. And like we said earlier, it kind of rubber stamps the identity. So I just wanted to touch on that and tell me, I mean, in your school trainings, what have you seen? What have you observed around social transition?
One thing I've observed really notably is the presumption in school staff that social transition has a good, strong evidence base supporting it. And I say there isn't. Not only is there not a strong evidence base, there is not an evidence base. There is
no studies.
Very little to kind of, nothing to really look at. So we don't know. This is a new intervention. It's come in recent years. There's nothing long-term to refer to. So we've no idea, and there's no evidence base. It came in as a theory and it has been ran with fast. And when I tell this to schools, it's like they are astonished to hear this.
Yeah.
They are literally astonished, to the point you can see some of them frantically Googling in front of me. She must be wrong. There must be evidence. And so I always kind of make sure to have, my T's crossed and my I's dotted around this. And that's what is crucially important, because as Hilary Cass said in her kind of, she did a great analysis of gender affirmative care in the UK for children. And she said it's not a neutral intervention. It does carry an extreme impact. If you think about it, the idea of somebody changing their name, changing the pronouns, not only will they be going into different sports teams with different changing rooms, residential dormitories, lots of other things, it can change your self-concept, and we don't know how much. How much. And it won't necessarily make people feel better, because it could arguably make them think about their identity a hell of a lot more. It could arguably make them feel dysphoric about how they're presenting isn't how they look under their clothes. It could create a gap. It could create a cognitive dissonance between themselves. And it can create so many more problems. It might solve these problems, but it can create these problems. And so when schools realize this, they tend to think, well, I remember only last week, like one teacher said, but why are we doing it then? Like, if there isn't an evidence base, why is this happening all over the world? And I was like, well, that's a long question. You should start listening to our podcast, because it's like, why has this intervention come in? And I would argue, a quick answer to that would be, hard cases make bad laws. And often a very, very distressed person was student zero in the school. That very, very distressed person might have gone on to medically transition, but they created the rules. The rules were created around this person, maybe 2014, maybe 2015, maybe further back. But it was one student who was extremely distressed, and a lot of precedents went in with that student. And then the social contagion has happened, which we've kind of well discussed in this podcast. And as a result, those rules specifically for that one student is now for the student body, and it was never anticipated. Just like in sports, they thought, we'll let one or two in. It's never going to be a big deal. The numbers are never, just like they thought in prisons. They never thought that there would be a contagion. They never thought that the numbers would shoot up. And so now it's an actual issue. But it wasn't, the rules weren't created as if there was ever going to be any sort of numbers. And so it's easy to make exceptions. It's easy to make a policy around a very tiny number of people who might have some other, extremely unusual issue. And you make a policy around it. The school is very happy. Everybody rolls on. It never comes up again because there aren't other students with that issue. But now I think the numbers have made it that, oh my God, they are so not equipped for something that has happened, I would say quite inadvertently and often quite mindlessly, with the presumption that there's a strong evidence base to assure everybody that this will not only make the student feel better, but it's better for everybody. And I would argue that anybody who's working in a school, especially principals, if you are going to create policies and change policies around students' safety or students' mental health or students' well-being, well, you need to do an impact assessment in the school, and you need to do a risk assessment in the school, because you need to figure out how is this going to impact the school body in the longer term, because what happens to a 12-year-old will be happening to a 17-year-old in a few years, if you follow me. And they have to look to the future. And I don't envy them. I think it's really hard.
I know. And you bring up a point that's really important. When I was working in a school, whenever there was a situation, whether it's like a student who it was discovered that they were dealing with self-harm, or, unfortunately a suicide or something like that, the school has an immense amount of pressure and eyes on them to just do something.
God, yeah.
Just do something. And as young people
and be seen to do it. Yeah.
And be seen and make it, announce it, like have an initiative. We're starting an initiative. And so, of course, as a lot more young people are starting to question their identities, schools have a great deal of pressure to just show that they're doing something to meet the demand that is changing, to meet the culture where it's at. And I think like so many things come to mind. When we say there's no research on social transition, I'm thinking specifically about the school's impact. But what we do know is that social transition seems to increase the likelihood that the gender identity will stay as is. Yeah. And the way that's often interpreted by people
that's the tiny bit of evidence, and it's not really evidence. It's
it's not great. It's just kind of like studies about the kind of the process of how these identities are unfolding. And of people who believe in social transition, who are pushing for social transition, they use that information to say, see, affirming identities is good because it's obviously the right choice if this person's going to continue to identify as transgender. But what we actually know from looking at studies over the last, several decades is that a lot of young people may question their identity, and then it will come and go, as many identity explorations do. So that's kind of one thing, which kind of goes back to that affirmation to transition pipeline that we touched on earlier. And then number two, I'm super aware now that I've become much more conscious of, evidence and data. When I was working in the school, there were so many times when an initiative was rolled out for which there was no evidence of whether or not it was effective. And it was our job to bring in initiatives, right? Like as the school counselors, there were a couple of us on campus, and every time something happened, they were like, quickly, counselors, do something. So we would basically just look up advocacy groups in the local area and bring them in. Never did we evaluate what is the outcome rate of this training? Does this improve or worsen the impact on students? Like, we just didn't even think about it. We had literally 5 minutes of our day when we had up to our eyeballs complicated cases to deal with. And we just had to like call somebody and schedule them to come into the school.
Yeah.
So this is another challenge that like all of these schools are just find a gender organization, quick, do a gender thing. And they're not really thinking about what this means or what the outcome will be. And it's very complicated.
And very pressurizing for the school. Like you say, a tragedy happens, and then a tragedy happened in my kids' local school, and immediately the school had to roll out things, which is not appropriate.
Yes.
And they had to be seen to roll out things, and it wasn't fair, and it wasn't, it's too much pressure, and it's part of this kind of instant gratification culture. But the issue of the initiatives and the local advocacy groups, the local experts, that goes back to Stephen Levine's chain of trust. We all presume, the schools presume that the local expert on anything, whether it's gender or whether it's autism or whatever, we just presume they're brilliant and they know more than us. And in they come, and there's an awful lot of presumption around expertise and that, and that's just something to be aware of. And not only that, I know when I wrote my book, Bully Proof Kids, I was shocked, and it turns out it's a well-established fact that bullying programs haven't worked out very well in schools.
Yeah.
They were brought in and they have not had good outcomes. And that was like, wow, you just presume bringing in a anti-bullying program that it's going to be good for a school. The results on that has not been good. So our tinkering with the well-being of students, I don't think has been a brilliant affair. I think schools are lovely places to be these days, but I think that there are an awful lot of kind of misguided interventions.
Yeah. And we can't really talk about this subject of like, why are schools taking on these policies? Why are schools socially transitioning kids without addressing, I think, the most common belief, which is these kids will become suicidal if you don't affirm them. And this is such an important and tragic possibility, and it's terrifying. And if you think about the experience of a teacher who's just there trying to teach math, and they're like, I don't want to be the reason a kid commits suicide. That's terrifying. So, this is very serious, and I want us to give it a few moments. We've done a full episode on suicide, and this is something that keeps coming back up over and over because I think this is the most common, I guess, piece of terrifying information that is frankly quite misrepresented. And I just want to spend a minute talking about this. Giving it the kind of proper weight that is due. So where should we start? Right. Because people really misunderstand these points.
I think an acknowledgement that suicide is terrifying, and it's so terrifying we have to up our game. But what often happens is it's so terrifying we react reflexively. And I'm just because we're human, no other reason. And we need to hasten, slowly when suicide is in the air. We need to make sure that we know the facts. We need to make sure that we penetrate any kind of half-baked facts and make sure that they are facts. Because, for example, there's a lot of misinformation around the facts around suicide. I think it began with very distressed children, perhaps, and there was kind of an awful lot of talk around suicide. Certainly now that gender has been in the kind of clinics for long enough, if you can look at Michael Biggs' research from GIDS over in London, and this is over a 10-year period, 4 out of 15,000 children died by suicide. And every one of those 4 is a terrible tragedy, an absolute devastating event that shouldn't have happened. But of those 4, 2 were receiving treatment, affirmative treatment, and 2 were in the waiting list. So you can't even extrapolate anything from this. You know what I mean? Other than...
Sorry, what was the stat? How many?
4 out of 15,000.
Out of
over
15,000, okay.
Yeah, 4 out of 15,000 out of over a 10-year period.
Okay.
And so while this is higher than the average, it is in keeping, give or take, it's in keeping with children with mental health distress.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's not a world where we need to make sure that we act really fast because it's a very imminent threat that's going to happen very soon. That is not the actual facts of the case. The facts of the case is when people are in mental health distress, in any, whether it's anxiety or depression or eating disorders, it is more likely, but it is not something that should throw you off, and you shouldn't be making decisions that are shaped by something when really it should be the full situation, as opposed to, I'm so frightened of this, I'm just going to make quick decisions. Because we all know sometimes you do. In an emergency, something's happened and you make a quick decision because you had to. This is not. This is not this case. You know what I mean? A gender distressed kid is not an emergency around suicide.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people are so afraid of the possibility that they may not be slowing down to investigate, well, what do we know about preventing suicide? What do we know factually about this? Because as sad as it is, kids with mental health issues, kids with gender dysphoria are not the first population of kids who have struggled with suicidality or suicidal ideation. And, in any competent mental health treatment program, if there's a young person struggling with suicidality, there are kind of like, treatment plans, safety plans protocols that we do to help minimize the risk, to help get the kid to reduce the chances that they will take that step. So I can't think of any other examples where a suicidal young person is given the exact kind of possibly self-destructive thing that they're asking for. Like if a young person is saying, if you let me do so-and-so thing, I won't kill myself. Like it's usually coming from a place of incredible despair. They're not thinking clearly. They're in a dark place. They hate themselves. So that is not how we tend to respond when a young person is struggling with suicidality.
And that is accepted in every other realm. And that's where I think it's worth talking about the kind of the exceptionalism of gender, because schools suddenly get told, when suicidality comes up with anxiety or an eating disorder or substance abuse, we don't respond reactively. We follow the protocol, we follow the system, because that's the most important thing to do, is not lose your head. And the exceptional kind of with gender, it's like everything put that aside and do this new thing that doesn't have an evidence base. And that's what I think you and I are trying to work hard to kind of make sure that people don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's no need to kind of lose your head with anything. It's more important to keep your head and keep your kind of faith in your process than to presume that this requires different rules because there's nothing quite like gender. I do think it's funny. It's that famous phrase, born in the wrong body, which has no substance, but an awful lot of schools still use it. They say, but what would it be like to be born in the wrong body? And I often say, well, what does that mean? We're born as our bodies. We die as our bodies. We have no other options. And they kind of, you can see them going, oh, you know what I mean? And then that's when I realised that people think it's some sort of innate. So often they think it's kind of gay part 2. It's gay 2.0, if you follow me. And that all those gay children were treated so badly in other generations. And now we've got a second chance. And this chance is to teach and support and help the trans students who are just like gay people, frankly. They were born with some sort of condition. It's born in the wrong body. And now we can facilitate their transition. I honestly think most teachers and counsellors I work with come from that place, as opposed to they don't seem to me to be very up on the policies. They're much more culturally attuned to that way of thinking. And I don't think it's an accurate way of understanding gender.
Yeah, and frankly, I mean, part of the reason that we're so concerned is there may be a possibility that the young people identifying as trans might indeed be gay. And because they're struggling to accept that about themselves, and it's very common to have kind of maybe like less than typical gender experiences if you are a gay person, and they're kind of getting subsumed by the concept of being transgender, which, like you said, I think if you buy into this idea that you could just be born in the wrong body, that's a very powerful suggestion. And, you know, it explains to the teacher or the administrator something that seems kind of hard to understand. You know, why is this kid trying to change their entire identity, to change their body? Oh, born in the wrong body. That kind of clicks. And I want to ask about, I want to make sure we get to this. Let's say we're giving some concrete advice to teachers or counselors who have a kid questioning their gender. We talked about how to respond in a way that doesn't close the door and kind of leaves it open for exploration. Let's talk about how we would loop in the family and create a kind of support plan that is collaborative with the parents. Do you have thoughts on that? I know you do a lot of school training, so can you touch on that?
I think schools are very accustomed to students saying, I'm throwing up, don't tell my parents, they'll kill me. Or I'm being bullied, don't tell my parents, they'll take my phone away. You know what I mean? It's a well-trodden path.
Yes.
And I think what you generally do is you don't run out and tell the parents immediately, but you do work with the student to build in a situation where you can tell the parents. Very quickly people come in saying, but there's cultural differences. And often this is why we can't tell, because maybe the parents are very religious, or the parents are very culturally against, gender issues or sexual orientation. I still think that, like, we can work with families. I know some people mightn't agree, but I still think just because your family have a religion and they will steer you away from, for example, the Gay Straight Alliance or something like that, and you're 14 and you want to be in it, I don't think it is necessarily... You still have those parents. So, you have to navigate having your very religious parents. And lots of people have very religious parents. And they navigate it and they come out intact. So if you have a school that's very welcoming and says that we are going to tell your parents, but we're going to work with you to tell your parents. And we accept they're not going to accept it. And you will have a place. You will have a safe harbour with us. You will have. But we're not going to override your parents' way of being, because they've chosen to raise you in a certain way. And when you're 18, you'll be able to live the life you choose. You will be free. So we're going to keep you, we're going to educate you, we're going to make sure that you have places to go. You can go to the counsellor every day, every week. You can, to kind of manage your distress in living with very religious parents. But unless they're actually hurting you, and then we call social services, we don't have to act as if it's so very dreadful to have religious parents. Lots of people have religious parents and they love their parents, but they say, oh, they're very old-fashioned. It's okay, I believe.
And I think the much more common scenario, at least in my experience, is that the young people, due to kind of maybe information they've been getting online or kind of scary stories they've read on the internet, they presume their parents are going to be very rejecting. And these are actually kids that are not from necessarily super religious. And even for the families that I've worked with who are religious, they're like, we go to church, but our church is gay friendly and trans friendly. Like, these are not extremists, So I think in that case, it's very important to help the child kind of like reality test their concerns. And I remember working in a school, a lot of kids would say that exact line, like, if you tell my parents, they're going to kill me. And it's like, it turns out, no, your mom's going to come into the office with us and she's going to tear up because she didn't realize you were cutting yourself, or she didn't realize you were having this trouble. She's going to ask you how she can help. Like, it's usually not nearly as punitive as the child imagines.
And often, maybe, not often, sometimes they're going to disagree. And that's okay. You're now an adolescent. You're starting to individuate. You're starting to live a life where you don't quite agree with some of your parents' values. That's okay. No, that's all right. That's perfectly fine. The school doesn't have to come in and save you and create this dysfunctional triangulation just because people disagree. You can jog along. This is perfectly fine. I do want to talk a little bit more about, because it's such I find a lot of schools aren't aware of what you talked about, the internalized homophobia. And this could be a lesbian who hates being a lesbian and doesn't want to be a lesbian and ends up transing to being a boy to avoid her sexual orientation. That can be a real jaw-dropping, penny-dropping moment for a lot of schools where they think, I didn't think of that. I could be intruding on a sexual awakening. And I'm like, yeah, actually, you go in too fast, you could definitely be intruding on a sexual awakening. And we, in schools and in society, we're very uneasy about how to handle a sexual awakening in an adolescent. And so if the child is very often almost prudish, how dare you talk about my sexuality? Yes, I know I came out as a lesbian. Never mention that again. You can only talk about my gender, and don't you dare ever bring it up. Well, I'm not saying any student, and no school teacher needs to jump in. The counsellor doesn't need to jump in. They do need to clock it as the adult in the room, that there could be more going on than is the presenting issue. Another thing I find that is really important for teachers and counsellors to know is the likelihood for this child, if they haven't presented as a child maybe from early. I always talk about there's early onset, which is somebody like me. I was 3 or 4 and I was a boy. The whole town knows it. It's not secretive and it's very loud. That's one type. And they're very often, gay or lesbian or bisexual. Then there's another type. There's a new cohort. And you schools all know the new cohort because they've come into your schools and you worked in the school 10, 15 years ago. They weren't there. So there's the new cohort that were never there before. And very often, this new cohort are highly vulnerable. They might be undiagnosed autism. They might have undiagnosed eating disorder. They might have diagnosed autism or anxiety or ADHD. The likelihood of comorbidities and coexisting conditions is really quite high.
It's high.
With these. Yeah. They're called late onset, as in they didn't show. And maybe, some of the early onsets certainly have it as well, so I shouldn't just say that, but it's a red flag. If a child comes to you and they've never before presented with gender issues and they suddenly come in full on, and you realise that there's a huge amount of computer activity shaping this because their language is suddenly incredibly adult and very complex, and you're kind of looking thinking, what is going on? Yes, you're right. Your instinct is right as a professional who works with teenagers that there is more going on. There's a huge online community that is really encouraging this, and there's a tendency for very vulnerable teenagers who are unhappy, who've had a traumatic event, who might the likelihood of autism is high with this community. And not only that, it could be ADHD, it could be eating disorder, it could be anxiety. There are other conditions. So if you don't know all those things, you're not seeing the full student. You're just seeing one thing and not seeing the holistic view. So it's really important that teachers and counsellors are aware of that.
Yeah. This is such a big topic, and we're going to be returning to this schools question a lot. We've already conducted several interviews with important school administrators, school principals, other professionals in education, and we think it's going to really... We're trying to build a robust kind of resource list for people in schools. I think for now, this is a good place to leave it off. If there are teachers or school counselors who watch this or listen to this and you have specific questions for us, please leave them in the comments. We often kind of reflect back on some of the comments on our YouTube channel and try to build full episodes off of those. And if you are interested in joining our listener community, we answer specific Q&As within that platform. So you can go to widerlenspod.com and click on listener community there. And we hope that this is kind of going to add to this information that will be really valuable as many school professionals realize that just affirmation only doesn't seem to be the right solution.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. Listener support means a lot to us. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave a review.
For more information, visit widerlenspod.com. There you'll learn about joining our listener community, how to contribute to our show, and where to find us on social media.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.